Unul dintre fondatorii CIA, Frank Wisner, a primit o lecție dură de istorie chiar la București în timpul celui de-al Doilea Război Mondial. Ofițerul de inteligență a observat cum România era capturată de ideologii sovietici, felie cu felie. De altfel, metoda folosită de Stalin a primit chiar numele de tehnica salamului. Experiența l-a marcat pe viață pe agentul american, care vedea cum experimentul făcut de ruși la noi în țară se multiplica în jumătate de Europa. O prezență americană puternică și continuă în regiunile influențate de Rusia. Acesta a fost sfatul pe care l-a repetat neobosit cel care, între timp, participa la formarea celei mai puternice agenții de informații din lume. Generalul David Petraeus a fost directorul CIA după o carieră militară remarcabilă. Discutăm împreună despre lecțiile războaielor din perspectiva spionilor și cea a militarilor. Sunt Cristina Cileacu, începe Pașaport Diplomatic. General David Petraeus, former CIA director, welcome to Diplomatic Passport.
Good to be with you, Christina. Thanks.
General, CIA is the most powerful intelligence agency in the world. We owe them, for instance, the precise information about the starting the war in Ukraine. But in the same time, we have to remember as well that CIA was accused of using enhanced interrogations. Is there a limit when we talk about obtaining important information?
Yeah, very much so. In fact, I've been against enhanced interrogation techniques all along. The limit is the laws of land warfare, the Geneva Convention. And the truth is that enhanced interrogation techniques not only are wrong, in my view, they're also not very effective. I went back through the record as the director of the CIA. It wasn't clear that we got anything particularly important. There are different views on this, but my sense is that there was not anything that was a really extraordinary bit of information that we got through the use of these EITs. It has since been made illegal for the U.S. military. There was a manual that was written when I was between my tours in Iraq. In addition to the counterinsurgency field manual, there was also a manual on human intelligence collection operations, and it was given the force of law not just for the Army but for the entire military by Senator John McCain, who was the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee at the time, and had been subjected to what would have been enhanced interrogation technique, really torture, not just EITs, if you will. So again, I think there are limits. I think we have recognized those limits on reflection. We won't do that again. It will also cost us an enormous amount in the eyes of the world. And I think that, as did Abu Ghraib, by the way. And again, it's a lesson. We should learn from these experiences. And the truth is, if you want information from a detainee, we found out over many years that the best way to do it is for the interrogator to become the detainee's best friend. And that sounds very simplistic or trite, but in a way that is what has to happen. No one was responsible as a commander for more detainees than I was, which was during the surge in Iraq when we had 27,000 Iraqis. We opened up all of our detention facilities, including those used by our special mission units, by our counterterrorism forces, to the Red Cross and other observers. We were frankly proud of the standards we were meeting in those facilities, and also the ones in Afghanistan that we oversaw. So we tried to be as transparent as we could, as open as we could, but also as effective as we could in dealing with detainees, not just in getting information from them to flesh out our knowledge of extremist groups and insurgent elements and so forth, but also in trying to have a reintegration process back into society that worked as well. Because when I took command in Iraq at the beginning of the surge, the recidivism rate, in other words, the rate that they'd go back into incarceration or into detention, was over 90%. And by the end of my time there, not because of me, but because of the great work of the people that oversaw the task force that did the detainee operations, it was down around 5%. So we had a whole process that was developed of assessing the individuals, first getting the extremists out of their midst and putting them in maximum security. And then the rest of them, we had moderation religion classes taught by Iraqis, not by Americans. We bought a brick factory so they could learn how to make bricks, which was something very important in the wake of all the damage and destruction from all the fighting. There was a bread factory. There were basic skills education classes and then a whole process of putting the detainees back into their communities with their tribal leaders in charge of them, community leaders in the Ministry of Justice also taking responsibility for them, and it resulted in a vast improvement, as I said, in a tremendous reduction in the rate of recidivism in those individuals.
Well, perhaps not many people know the fact that one of the founders of what is now CIA, I'm talking about Frank Wisner, was posted in Bucharest as back then OSS agent, and he witnessed with his own eyes the occupation of Bucharest by Soviet Union, like an experiment of taking half of Europe to the Soviet Union. It was his life experience and haunted him all his life, and he promoted constantly this idea of American being present in the area and fighting against Russians with pro-democratic weapons. Do you think this idea of fighting against occupationist states is clear today?
I think it's not as clear as it was certainly during the Cold War, and what he witnessed was really something quite extreme, needless to say. And that was the assessment of what was going on behind the Iron Curtain, on the other side of the Berlin Wall and so forth. There was a very clear and present danger at that time. And that hasn't been the same assessment, at least until Vladimir Putin carried out his second invasion of Ukraine a little over 2 years ago. I think it's very clear what Putin wants to do, which is to reassemble as much of the former Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, however you want to deal with it. Remember, this is an individual who, when he was asked what was the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, a century that had 2 world wars and the Great Depression, responded the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It gives an insight into his thinking. And of course, if we just listened to the speeches that he made really intently and believed what he said in these grievance-filled revanchist and revisionist rants, I think we would have not been surprised by what he did, again, some 2 years ago, although the U.S. was firmly very clear that he was going to invade at that time.
You have elections in the U.S. and of course the entire world is watching the U.S. elections being so important for the entire world, but we have to remember an episode that we all witnessed, Donald Trump together with Vladimir Putin in a summit in Helsinki, being against U.S. intelligence agency in front of the cameras, in front of international media. Can the U.S. intelligence or any intelligence work with the president that does not agree with them?
Well, you don't have a choice. You don't get to choose your president, and the job is to speak truth to power. And that's what the CIA is absolutely determined to do, as are the other elements of the intelligence community in the United States. That's what they did in the previous term, and that's what they would do regardless of who the president is. They're going to give their best professional intelligence analysis and advice.
And if Donald Trump wants to put in place his plan of being president for the 3rd time, because already in his speeches has this idea, regardless of U.S. Constitution.
These are somewhat fantastical stories and so on, and you have to realize that it takes a good bit of what it is that he tweets and says with a grain of salt. We've learned that long ago. You know, I used to say when he was president in the 1st term, listen to the tweets, read the tweets, listen to what he says, but then follow the troops, follow the money, and follow the policy. Because he was critical of NATO countries that weren't spending 2% of GDP. By the way, that's been true of presidents of either party for many, many years. I was a 4-star commander under a Republican who criticized NATO for not spending 2% of GDP, those countries that did not, and a Democratic president who was also irritated and criticized countries that didn't spend 2% of GDP. But actually, Trump could probably take credit for the fact that more countries, along with, of course, Vladimir Putin invading, that many more countries are spending 2% of GDP. Importantly, it includes the 3rd largest economy in the world, Germany. Japan is doubling its defense spending in a 5-year period. Other countries are all increasing. And the EU itself even committed $50 billion most recently, right before the Munich Security Conference. And actually, Munich was very different this year. The Europeans were all deadly serious. They'd just committed $50 billion in aggregate from the EU. Each country was doing security agreements with Ukraine, and it was the U.S. that was wrangling in the House of Representatives, temporizing, debating endlessly over the $61 billion of security assistance that was ultimately approved with a bipartisan majority in each of our houses. So again, I think you have to be a little bit careful and not get too far out into the if this, then that, and who's going to do what. I think that speculation is not particularly fruitful.
Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin had recently signed a pact. They say that they want to make the world less chaotic. Of course, they forgot to mention that one of them is a chaos maker. What this pact means for all the democracies, how do you see it?
Well, we have seen greater alignment between Russia and China. Of course, they had the agreement of partnership without limits, as it was termed, on the eve of the Beijing Olympics, which is also, it turned out, the eve of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. You see Iran working more closely with Russia, providing drones and missiles and so forth as well, and then to a degree vice versa. North Korea sent 1 million rounds of artillery ammunition and presumably other munitions and weapon systems to Russia. So there is a greater alignment in that regard, and certainly those countries and perhaps some others around the world, including perhaps one here in Eastern Europe, don't necessarily embrace the rules-based international order as it's described, that was largely constructed and maintained and sustained by the U.S. and the other victors of World War II, the other Western community countries. But that's, we understand that, we recognize it, we need to resist that, we need to push back, ensure that we avoid conflict over this, real conflict, but also avoid them trying to interfere in our own politics, to inflame debates that might exist, to create differences or make them larger. All of that is ongoing. There's a great deal of effort. We've seen this. This is documented, what happened in the 2016 election in the United States, how various accounts in Facebook were used, fictional accounts, and the rest of that. And we need to be a lot more vigilant in identifying and resisting that, and then in pushing back as well.
Speaking about this way of new fight, let's call it like that, since you have a lot of experience in wars, you've been in several, you studied them, you even wrote a book about them, about the evolution of the conflict. How do you see the challenges that a leader for this type of new wars we have now?
Well, I think it's always true that the strategic leader, if you will, the leader at the top in a war, and I was privileged, of course, to command 2 wars at their height, the surge in Iraq and then the surge in Afghanistan, and to have 3 other combat commands in addition to that as a general officer alone. In all cases, the leader at the top has to perform 4 tasks superbly if there is to be a chance at achieving the objectives. You have to get the big ideas right, craft the right strategy, have a real in-depth knowledge of your forces, the enemy forces, the physical terrain, the human terrain, all the elements of society, the neighborhood, how the country is supposed to operate, how it really operates, all the rest of this. Craft the right strategy, get the big ideas right, communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization and with all others who have a stake in the outcome of the conflict. Oversee the implementation of the big ideas, what we normally think of as leadership, the example provided by the leader, the energy, the inspiration, hiring great people, allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else, the organizational architecture that you design, the metrics that are used, and how the leader spends his or her time is crucial. And that's how you drive a campaign plan's execution. And then a 4th task, which is to identify how you need to refine the big ideas, how you need to modify the strategy as the context evolves so that you can do it again and again and again. And clearly when it comes to all the different forms of warfare that are going on, whether it is, again, the kinetic actions or the non-kinetic, the other elements that should be part of a comprehensive, integrated strategy, you have to get those ideas right. And among those is the necessity to, again, identify propaganda, misinformation, which is far more problematic in a world of social media and news channels that align very much more with one party or the other in some cases, and so on. So all of that has to be done properly, And it starts with the strategic leader, with the help of all the folks around him or her, crafting that right strategy. And it has to address all of the different elements of the war that the enemy is prosecuting.
And if we look towards the politics, because usually the decision of starting a war belongs to the politician.
Without question, sure. The strategic leader.
Of leaders? Do you see them today in our world?
We have some, and then there are some others that perhaps don't have all the qualities or elements that you might like to see. But no, I think there's some very impressive leaders around the world.
Talking about your experience in the war zone, how do you see Europe as defending itself without United States? Is this possible?
It's not possible in the way that has traditionally been NATO's architecture and NATO's capabilities. Let's be realistic here. The U.S. doesn't just spend more than all of its NATO allies put together, and of course 2 new allies added to the mix, very capable ones, Finland and Sweden. It spends more than twice as much as all of them put together, and it's not that conceivable how you would have a NATO that would be remotely as capable as this one is, with the U.S. often in a leadership role and often providing the foundational forces for whatever mission is undertaken. If you look at Afghanistan, for example, we only had 3,500 troops in the end. Other countries had more than twice that number, but when the U.S. pulled out, they all had to pull out as well, because without that base formation that the U.S. provided and all the different capabilities that we had, way beyond just boots on the ground, but all of the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance systems, the intelligence fusion that is so important, all the other elements that the U.S. brought to bear, it just wasn't possible for the other countries to stay without us. So I think, again, it would just be a very, very different NATO were the U.S. not to be part of it.
And talking about the war in Ukraine, the war that Russia started in Ukraine, nobody sees an end. We just witness the help coming again from United States, but still the Ukrainians seems not to regain their strength, and Russia is winning in this period.
Russia is certainly on the offensive. It has the momentum to a degree, but it largely tactical gains. Now, I'm very worried about what's going on around Kharkiv and the possibility that Russia could get within artillery range, in which case it will just blow Kharkiv to smithereens. And it is hitting Kharkiv very, very hard with glide bombs and with these other S-300s and other munitions. It would like to destroy Kharkiv. And again, we need to do everything we can to enable the Ukrainians to refill this U.S. pipeline, which is ongoing. But Ukraine is still in a perilous period right now. But they also have to come to grips with their force generation challenges. Again, they had a very emotional debate in the Rada over the conscription law, which is very different from those of most countries. When I was privileged to command in combat, the average age of our soldiers on the front lines was 19 to 22. In Ukraine, it's over 40, because, again, you didn't conscript until the age of 27, and sometimes later than that. Now, they've reduced that to 25. They've closed some other loopholes that allowed people to avoid serving and so forth. But they now have got to really generate substantial numbers of additional soldiers, additional units, and so forth. And this $61 billion worth of U.S. assistance, which is a colossal amount, it's nearly 20 billion more than we've given in all the 2 years of the war prior to this. And that will enable them for quite a period of time, together with all the terrific support that Europe, as the EU in aggregate, and then individual European countries are providing as well. The future of this war depends on a number of factors: continued U.S. assistance, continued European assistance, continued Ukrainian force generation. But there's a reality here, and that is that Ukraine has a population well less than one third of Russia's. Russia is seemingly unconcerned by casualties, and Russia has an economy that's 10 times the size of Ukraine's as well. Although it's really heartening to see what Ukraine has done in the Black Sea, where they've destroyed over 1/3 of the Black Sea fleet, which is difficult for Russia to replace because they can't put warships through the Bosphorus, according to the the Montreux Convention, which Turkey enforces. So that's a very significant achievement because it allows them to export grain by ship in the Western Black Sea, from which the Russians have had to withdraw, including from the very important port of Sevastopol in Crimea. And it's absolutely critical for food security for Egypt and another number of other African countries as well.
How CIA and Romanian intelligence are working from your experience as a former director of the agency?
Very well, actually. I think the agency established very good relationships with the Eastern European countries that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact, or in the circle, if you will, of the Soviet Union. And those relationships have continued to grow and to prosper over the years, and frankly they've become even more important now with all that's going on in Ukraine, noting that Romania has the longest border of any country with Ukraine on either side, and in between is Moldova, which would be the next on the list for Putin if he were ever to prevail in Ukraine. So these are important relationships. They're also very important in military to military because of this geographic location, because of the assets that Romania offers. I'd end by just noting that I was privileged to serve with Romanian forces in the Balkans, a year in Bosnia included among that, 4 years in Iraq, actually on the ground, and then beyond that as the commander of U.S. Central Command, the year in Afghanistan, and then overseeing all of that, if you will, as the director of the CIA. And every citizen of this country can be very proud of their men and women who wore the Romanian uniform in those conflicts, and also, frankly, serve in the ranks of the spies, diplomats, and development workers as well.
So we have a lot of CIA spies in Romania for the moment.
I cannot confirm nor deny.
Thank you so much, General.
Privileged to be with you, Christina.
Atât pentru astăzi, dar rămânem în continuare online pe pagina de Facebook a emisiunii și pe contul nostru de X. Revenim cu subiecte noi din lumea diplomației și a politicii externe, vinerea viitoare de la 11:30 și reluare sâmbătă după miezul nopții. La revedere!